be the moderator of tonight. If you don't know SIP, we are a student association characterized by a combination of fun, social activities, and intellectual programs. And normally those would be physical meetings, but as we must adhere to the coronavirus measures, our activities will once again continue online. But that doesn't stop us from discussing important topics, as that is also what we will be doing tonight. As you can see, the title of tonight's program is Between Dictatorship and Democracy, which you could argue are two sides of the same spectrum. So in dictatorships, of course, the rulers or just one ruler has absolute power and the population has little to no freedom. And of course, in liberal democracies, the opposite is true. So classic examples of dictators are historical fascist figures like Hitler and Mussolini, and we tend to view this form of dictatorship as belonging to the past. Well, hopefully so. However, political developments in the world over the past few years seem to suggest that at least some countries are moving towards more authoritarian rule again. And the most recent and unprecedented example is perhaps the United States, where President Trump is openly doubting whether or not to accept the results of the upcoming election, which we might also touch upon tonight briefly. But more importantly, closer to home, we should also note the developments in Hungary, Poland, Belarus, and Russia, where state leaders seem to direct more and more power to themselves. So tonight we will discuss what that looks like in practice, how it can be explained, and what the future looks like for these modern autocrats. And we will do that with an expert on the topic, namely Jenne Holtland. So welcome, Jenne. I'm glad that you join us tonight. And could you maybe tell us a bit about who you are and what your background is?
Absolutely. Well, good evening, everybody. Thanks, Robert, for the kind introduction, and apologies for coming to you from what looks like a BBC setup or something with the bookshelf behind me. It's not at all something I did on purpose or something. Yeah, I really appreciate the invitation. So I'm in Budapest. I'm in Hungary, which is where I live. I'm based here as the correspondent for Dutch newspaper De Volkskrant, which some of you might know. And as such, I'm responsible for covering the whole Central and Eastern European region, as we call it. So that's mostly Hungary and Poland, two countries that are quite dominant, I would say, in the region. But I was also in Romania recently. I've been to Bulgaria over the summer. Covers Slovakia, Czech Republic, and a few other countries, the Baltics. So that's my expertise. I won't be able to go into Belarus and Russia, unfortunately, because for the reason that I don't cover them. I don't travel there, but I think Poland and Hungary offer quite a story on themselves. As a very brief caveat, just before we go on, is that. Very strictly speaking, I'm currently on leave. I'm writing a book on a completely different matter, and I'm lucky enough to work for a paper that was happy to facilitate that. So they allowed me to go on leave, and I now have somebody filling my shoes in Warsaw, in Poland, and he's doing a great job. So that's the current situation. So technically speaking, I'm not the correspondent, but I'm still happy to discuss what's happening right now. And I'll be back at my position in March. So that's where we're at.
Okay, great. So I will just now briefly explain the format of the evening. So first, I will interview Jenne about his thoughts on modern authoritarianism, which will take about 40 minutes. And after that, there will be plenty of time to discuss questions that you have. So when you think of a question, just post it in the chats of YouTube or Facebook. It doesn't matter which platform, and we will discuss those after the interview. And then the live stream will end at around 9:15. Also, we would really like to know what you thought of this evening, so you can vote and give us a grade, I guess, by clicking on the link in the description. So please do that after the live stream. So farewell, that's all the formal stuff out of the way. So let's now get into modern authoritarianism. So my first question is, for those that are not familiar with what authoritarianism is exactly, what is it and how is it defined?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I wish I was a political scientist to really, be very specific about definitions. There's plenty flying around, to be honest. Some people call what Hungary and Poland are doing competitive authoritarianism. There are multiple ways of looking at this. I am more of a fan of what's called the Franken-state, which is a model I'll try to explain a bit, and it applies to both Hungary and Poland. And basically what we're talking about, and that's the elegance, I think, of the title for tonight's discussion, is, as you said, is between dictatorship and democracy. So the leadership in both Poland and Hungary have managed to sort of carve out, if you will, a third form. So we thought, as you said in your introduction, we thought up until a few years ago that it was either or, right? So you're either a liberal democracy, full stop, and you check all the boxes, or you're a sort of a dictator or an authoritarian, and you start imprisoning opposition leaders, much like is happening in places like Turkey and Russia. Now, the Polish and the Hungarian case is very interesting and even troubling, I think, in a way, but it's interesting in the sense that it's like a third form. And Orban himself likes to talk of an illiberal democracy, so a democracy that is not liberal. And basically what it means is that he has, for the past 10 years, systematically undermined the regular checks and balances that you normally have on a democratic system. So I always tend to compare it with a house. So the house of the democracy, the facade is still there. So if you look at it at Hungary right now, there are still free elections. There's still freedom of speech. As a journalist here, if you're a Hungarian journalist, my colleagues here, they can, to the law, like legally speaking, they can write what they want. So at the face of it, you would say that it's still a democracy. Where it becomes more problematic is if you look at what you could call the foundations of that house. So a democracy also rests on what we call the rule of law. And there, rule of law tends to be about the checks and balances, right? So one of them, which we'll talk more about tonight, I think, is an independent judiciary. Secondly, you talk about free media. There's civic space, civic organizations, NGOs, pressure groups, lobby organizations, and the like. And you've got parliament, so the opposition. And in all those sort of domains, you see that Orban has systematically shrinked sort of their wiggling room, their space, and to a certain extent has just cancelled them out. So very briefly, when it comes to Orban, he won the elections in 2010. And crucially, he was given 2/3 in parliament. So he didn't get 2/3 of the vote. He got a small majority. But because of the way the Hungarian constitution was devised, he was given a sort of a bonus on his victory. And through that bonus, he got 2/3 in parliament. Now, imagine the Dutch prime minister getting 2/3, getting the current VVD of Mark Rutte getting 2/3. 2/3 is anybody's dream. With 2/3 in parliament, you can do basically what you want, and that's exactly what Orban started to do. So he rewrote the constitution. Hungary has a completely new constitution ever since. He gerrymandered the districts, so the electoral districts were redrawn in such a way that they give Fidesz, his party, an upper hand. Much like actually is happening in the US, where gerrymandering is also sort of engraved in the system. He got rid of the judges in the Constitutional Court, which is also very normally a cornerstone of a rule of law. And he replaced them by his own loyalists. So now the constitutional courts can, you can bet a lot of money on it that they will always sort of vote with whatever the ruling party wants. So very, briefly, that's basically what has happened in Hungary since 2010. So what you're left with is a system where formally they're still they're still voting, and people still vote every 4 years. But more and more, it's starting to look like a system in which Orban will contend in the elections, but he can never lose. Because if you end up eroding all those checks and balances, you won't lose an election. It's as simple as that. Orban doesn't like to lose. He's a former football player. So often also in interviews, he'll say, I'm not the type for losing. I don't like losing. And there's even a historical precedent, maybe just to mention that briefly, is that the first time Orban was prime minister, and nobody ever, around these days, nobody really remembers that, but he was a prime minister in 1998 for the first time when he was in his 30s. And he lost after one term. He lost in 2002. And a lot of people in Hungary have basically observed that lost election changed something in his thinking, in his psyche, because he realized, okay, I don't want this to happen again. So next time when I win the elections, I'm going to make sure that all the cornerstones of the system are basically set in my favor, and that I'll keep power. And that's basically what happened. So I think we'll talk more also about the Polish example, because they kind of copied a huge chunk of the Hungarian playbook, if you will.
Yeah. Well, what I'm wondering right now, how did it come to be that one man could receive such a bonus and have 2/3 of the parliament?
Yeah. Well, excellent question. The thing is that you have to. I'm not a legal expert, but basically what happened is that in '89, right, when the whole system collapsed, communism collapsed. Hungary was under communist rule for 45 years, since the Second World War, roughly, and there was not really a revolution per se. There was the system just crumbled, and unlike in Poland, there was no like it was. Hungary was more. It was more sort of an haphazard thing. So the system crumbled, and they devised a new constitution, which made a lot of sense, right? So that constitution they redrew. Actually, they redrew the old constitution. They amended the old constitution from communist times and made it a democratic constitution. And in that constitution, they said, you know what, we fear that that we'll end up with a system with way too many parties vying for power, and that it will be very chaotic. And there was a general that made sense at the time. In the early 90s, there was this general idea that these democracies will never really succeed if you have like 6, 7, 8 parties. There's no tradition like in Holland or in Germany or in France with coalition building, with like building coalitions of several parties. So what they did is that they said, you know what, if you end up being the biggest party, you'll get a bonus. In order for that bigger party to get an upper hand and to facilitate sort of building of a small coalition, right? So in order for there not to be some sort of a big spaghetti of parties, and that was the idea. So at the time, it made a lot of sense, but in 2010, it took a turn that a lot of people now, I think, kind of regret, because it gave Orban a massive victory and basically a carte blanche to do whatever he wanted. So it was kind of a constitutional loophole that gave him those powers. Yeah.
Okay. So now we focus on Hungary, and maybe you can also tell us about Poland and the differences with what Orban is doing.
Yeah, absolutely. So basically, Poland is a country where I lived from 2016 up until earlier this year, when I moved to Budapest. I lived in Warsaw, and I arrived in November of 2016, about a year after the current ruling party came in power. So it's now 2020, so it's been exactly 5 years that a party called Law and Justice is in power in Poland, and Law and Justice has made it no secret that they really find it very interesting what Orban is doing. even the ruling man, like the big man in Poland, a guy called Jarosław Kaczynski, was kind of unknown in the rest of Europe because he's not the prime minister and he's also not the president. So it's a very intricate system. He's the party leader. It resembles a bit the communist system, where also the head of the state was never really the prime minister nor a monarch of sorts. It was more like the head of the party. So the head of the party there, Jarosław Kaczynski, is somebody who dreamt of a scenario like that, and it has remained a dream in a way because he wasn't given a 2/3. They won the election in 2015, but not by the margin that Orban was given. They won a simple majority, and that has made a huge difference. So one of the big things that Law and Justice, or PiS as they're called, so PIS, what they wanted to do was to reform the judiciary and also take over the constitutional court, like Orban had done in Hungary. And they started doing so, but because they didn't have a constitutional majority, they didn't have the 2/3. We often call that a constitutional majority. They didn't have that, so they had to do it with you could call it a blunter knife. They had to work with less elaborate materials, and they had to use certain tricks. So they would vote in certain controversial laws in the middle of the night. I remember that when I was in Warsaw, you would wake up and they would have passed this most outrageous legislation at 1 a.m. when the opposition wasn't paying attention. Right. And they started reforming, or you can actually say undermining, depending on where you stand, the judiciary. So they packed the Constitutional Court. Also there, the Constitutional Court is now completely in the hands of people, of loyalists of the ruling party. And they started basically taking over the foundational institutions that oversee the way judges are appointed. So I don't want to get into too much of this because it's very technical, but what it basically means is that you point out one group of judges and you say, those are our people. And you'd look at a certain other group of judges and you say, those people are the judges who we want to get rid of. Now, there's a whole ideology behind this, and it goes back to 1989. So, you maybe, Robert, you remember that I said just now that 89 wasn't a revolution the way some people would have liked to see it, right? So we tend to think of a revolution with tanks on the streets and bloodshed and a hard break, if you will, right? A hard break with the past. Now, 1989, both in Poland and Hungary, was more of a velvet revolution, as it was called back then. So no tanks on the streets, or hardly tanks on the streets, hardly any bloodshed, except for Romania. And it was more of a negotiated revolution. So the communist authorities back then gave way. They realized that they had to negotiate their way out, and they gave way for a democratic government. But those same communists managed to stay in certain, managed to stake out some places in the system. So, for example, the judiciary, there were judges back in the 90s who had been a judge during the communism and had managed to stay a judge in the new system. Now, Law and Justice, the ruling party in Poland, has made a huge deal out of that, and they claim that it might have been 30 years since the fall of the old system, but actually, the whole sort of the people who really matter in that system are the same old people, which is a lie. The average judge in Poland is 38 years old. Is most the over 90%, I would say, is probably from after that, right? There's probably only a handful of people who are from the old days, but Law and Justice has basically used that as an excuse to get rid of a huge swath of judges, and whoever resists those purges, you can say, as a judge, they risk disciplinary procedures. So they are fined. Some of them have lost their immunity, which opens up the way to court cases and perhaps even jail sentences. And there, if we're talking about an EU member state that is looking at possibly jailing judges, then you're looking at something that definitely sounds like, like what Erdogan has done, for example, in Turkey.
Yeah.
Some of these techniques are quite reminiscent of what's happening elsewhere.
So what we're seeing now, like the crumbling of democracy and independent judiciary in these countries, are those indirect effects of communism that trickle down, or is there also an influence, a modern influence of Russia? Because, well, state leaders also want to be friends with Putin.
I understand. Look, let me take that question apart, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
I think those two things are actually two completely different questions. The influence of Russia, I'll just leave for just a second.
Yeah.
When it comes to the influence of communism, well, yes and no, right? So if I start with Orban, considers himself a fighter against communism. And he was a member of the opposition back in the 80s when Fidesz was founded. His party was like a young bunch of guys who knew each other from college and had played football together and all that. And Orban fought against communism as an opposition leader and all that, and people saw his charisma and things like that. So he was member of the communist youth movement, as a lot of youngsters were, I think, and I think his father was active and all that. But to be honest, I don't think there's much to that. So it's not. I don't think we should look at what's happening as some sort of a going back to communism. In a weird way, it's a bit different. It's more like Orban prides himself of being a fighter against totalitarianism, against these old systems of oppression, and he thinks that it's all a bit complicated, but he thinks that liberalism, as we know it in the West, has basically sold out to Marxists and to leftists, etc. So he's lumped those things together. So in his mind, which sounds outrageous to Westerners, frankly, it does shock me sometimes. But whatever. Sometimes this is the discourse here, is that he lumps together leftist thinking with liberal thinking, and therefore you can hear him say during speeches that Brussels is now doing what Moscow used to do. They want to teach us democracy. They want to teach us how we need to live our lives. And obviously, amongst his voters, that's a hugely popular message. It rings true to people. This notion that there's a foreign power somewhere out there that wants to control and occupy Hungary. And this has a lot to do with history, right? With sort of the old ghosts of what happened in this area of Europe. So in a weird way, it's the opposite way around. And the same in Poland is where Kaczynski, the man I mentioned, the party leader, also stems from the opposition against communism. And as I said, he believes that the purging and cleansing of the judiciary in Poland is a way of getting rid of communist influences in the system rather than sort of reintroducing communism. But I agree with you that, of course, in a very ironic way, it does seem a bit like the past repeating itself. And just as a side note to that, it is true that Hungarians that I know and that I talk to sometimes, they will sometimes compare Orban to Kadar. And Kadar was the leader during communism here. And the resemblance is simply this. Kadar kind of made a deal with Hungarians. He was kind of a soft communist, as you can call it. They used to call that a goulash communist. Goulash being the famous Hungarian dish, right? So a goulash communist. So the idea being that Kadar told Hungarians, I won't imprison you or sort of and hunt you down if you don't mingle with politics. Leave, stay at home, do your own thing, live your life. There won't be any of those liberal freedoms, but I can assure you that I won't sort of interfere with your life if you don't interfere with politics. And that was for a lot of Hungarians, that was an okay trade-off. That was a good deal, and their deal to that extent was a bit better than, for example, what communism was like in Poland or in the DDR in Eastern Germany, for example. So there you can see a certain similarity, and I think we'll get more into that when it comes to civil society and things like that. Is that a lot of Hungarians are still very aloof and sort of trying to stay out of politics, don't really care all that much about what's happening, and kind of still have that old mentality that comes from the Kader. Yeah.
Okay, and maybe they're not going back to communism, but I was just wondering, it always seems like these charismatic and strong leaders are the ones that eventually, when they've won, for example, the elections, they direct all the power to themselves, which is, well, a form of populism, I guess. So does this new form of authoritarianism always go hand in hand with populism?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, look, I think once again we need to sort of be careful not to lump too many things together. I think populism is also kind of a technique of, it's also a way of speaking, right? So it's a rhetorical ploy. Like this is I notice sometimes when I use the word populism in my articles that some of my readers get a bit cross with me and say, what do you mean when you say that? Because people always throw that in, and even in Hungary, you can hear people say, "Oh, whenever you're called a populist, that just means that they don't like your your style of politics or whatever."
Yeah.
So I think my little definition of populism, and I go by Matthijs Rodijn, who is a political scientist in Amsterdam. He came up with a very elegant one, I think. And he says populism is kind of like it's a moral um, a moral monopoly, a moral claim on representation. That sounds maybe a bit complicated, but what it means is that you constantly, in speeches, in what you say in public, you say that I alone am this and the representative of the people, right? So you start talking about the people, which is a coherent, in the mind of a populist, is a coherent group. It's not a diverse group. It's a group that speaks with one voice, and it speaks in the elections, right? And whoever through the ballot box gets a majority is therefore the sole representative of the people. And there was a very telling moment, I think half a year ago, when one of Orban's people gave an interview here in Hungary and said that the opposition doesn't represent the Hungarian nation. They don't represent the Hungarian nation. And if you think about that, that's the most outrageous thing to say in a democracy, because it just doesn't fit. It doesn't go along with the pluralist mindset. It doesn't go along with an idea of clashing ideas, clashing interests, which should clash in parliament and in a flourishing democracy, right? So in that sense, I do agree with you that what we have here in Poland and in Hungary is a going together of sort of authoritarian forms of ruling with very populist ways of reasoning and rhetoric and language. And it makes it super hard to tackle as well, because when I interview people in the government or around people who vote Orban, they'll say, like, what is your problem exactly? We won fair and square. This is what you can hear Trump say as well, right? It's like, the Democrats never got over the fact that they lost. This is still about the Clinton losing at the time, etc. You can hear that here as well. Like, you guys lost, we won. So of course we're appointing our own judges. Of course we're appointing, our own people at tax authority, central bank, at the media, etc. They think that liberals are hypocrites, because they think that if liberals were more clever, they would like to do that as well. They're just not good enough, so they fail at dominating the system the way they do. But they think that that's how they look at sort of at the left or at more progressive voices, and it makes a conversation extremely difficult. Absolutely.
Yeah. And so you touched upon the US. What can explain, since the US is an entirely different continent, what can explain this rise in authoritarianism in some of these countries? Is it because the whole world is just polarized and
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, look, these are questions that the whole books are written about, right? So
yeah,
I don't want to promise that I can come up with a definitive answer. But there are a lot of forces at play. But one of them that I'd like to point out, and that's a big similarity between what's happening in my area and this area of the world with, for example, what's happening in the UK and what's happening in America. So back in 2016, if you look at the people who predominantly voted Brexit, who predominantly voted Leave, and who voted Trump, is that you were looking at people who were uh, by and large older, right? The Brexit vote was led by older people. Um, uh, you were looking at people in rural areas, very interesting, not urban areas, and that kind of has led to a split of sorts, right? So also now you can see that Biden is obviously going to win big in the urban areas in California, New York, in the two the east and the west coast, and you see it very similar here. It's like I live in Budapest. This is very much a liberal bubble. I find it difficult to find Fidesz voters here. You need to be very cautious to which neighborhoods you go to be able to sort of to speak to people who actually vote for Orban. Interestingly enough, as a side note, Fidesz, his party, lost the municipal elections in Budapest last year. So they lost the city, the capital, after ruling it for I think since 2006 or something. So they had been in power here for a long time, and now the urban electorate, young progressives, are sort of getting back at them. But this is the split. I think this is one factor that I would put to you as one thing that's at play, is that the rural and the urban are very much clashing, and they have their own media often that they read. They have their own worldview. Um, in Hungary, Orban is hugely popular in the countryside. So those are people, pensioners often, just to name it. Also, people who are with less money to spend, people who are less literate when it comes to the media, so they don't always know what's right and what's wrong, what's true, what's fake. There was a very telling example recently, a by-election, as it's called, so a local election that had to be called because a member of parliament died and his seat became vacant. And they had an election in his district. And there, Fidesz won, so Orban's party won by a small margin. And one of the things they did is that they handed out sacks of potatoes for a discounted price, which is I mean, it's a way of voter buying. There's no other way of putting it, but it's very brazen. They just did it. They handed it out, and it's a typical thing that you can do when you're in power, right? So you can get your hands on a load of load of potatoes in this case. There's been other cases like this. Orban in election time gives people often gives them a cut on their tax bill. So the electricity bill will get people get 10% on their electricity bill. It's hugely popular. It's amongst the most popular measures that this government has taken. It always comes out very high when you ask Hungarians what makes them happy with this party. Then they say, yeah, the money, the electricity bill. Yeah. So it's a clever ploy, and people in the urban areas are exasperated with that. People here don't understand why a voter would fall for that. But if you're a small family with not a lot of money to spend, then those things can make a difference. The energy bill will make a difference. And there's more. We can maybe go into that deeper in the Q&A with the listeners. But this is, I think, basically a huge factor that's at play, and it's been weaponized by these new leaders.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the question that is on everyone's minds since the coronavirus, we see a lot of news about these state leaders grabbing this opportunity to become even more powerful. So how has this had effect on these power developments?
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's a good question. I mean, Hungary became quite a headline again back in April, I think, or when was it? April or May? I think April, when Orban introduced an emergency measure, a state of emergency, to combat the pandemic, and it gave him the opportunity to rule by decree. for a few months. And of course, mostly the problem that the most critical voices took issue with the fact that emergency law didn't have a sunset clause, as you call it, didn't have a cap on it. It didn't say, the law itself, the text didn't say until when it ran. So in most democracies that have emergency measures, just as a small side note, the Netherlands doesn't. So if you're wondering why there hasn't been such a thing in the Netherlands, it's because the Dutch constitution doesn't provide for a state of emergency. But a lot of constitutions have such a thing, and you can call for it in times of emergency. But crucially, it's also about the dose. It's about sort of the you know putting out there how long that state of emergency will be in place. And this one didn't. It was indefinite. And they said, when I spoke to the Minister of Justice at the time, and I said, how will you know when to terminate it? And she said, well, we'll know when the WHO knows that sort of we've mastered the virus, etc. In the end, they terminated it over the summer. So it's no longer in power, but it's no longer present. But it gave Orban a huge, and again, a lot of power. So one of the things he started to do is that a lot of his opposition are mayors in urban areas who were voted in last year, and those mayors wanted to implement certain measures, of course, also in terms of the virus. So he started to, through those emergency decrees, he started to say, we need certain money that used to be allocated to the cities. We need that money in the state budget now. So he just cut their funding. And presumably also, he would say, I have nothing against the opposition. It's just, we need this money now, etc. He took half of the state subsidy to political parties. So all opposition parties receive some state subsidy. There's one party that doesn't really need that state subsidy, which is the ruling party. They couldn't care less about that subsidy. So what do? You cut that subsidy in half so that you hit opposition parties the hardest. So Orban used it massively, absolutely, and to his benefit. And there was one case also. What he did is that they, coincidentally, yes or no, I'm not sure, but right after the emergency entered, he also made it impossible by law to change your gender. So in your passport. So I did a story about the transgender community in Hungary, outraged about this, because basically now you can't, legally speaking, you can't change your gender anymore in the books, like in the in your passport. And that was a huge blow. And there's a suspicion that he used the virus as a sort of a cover so that nobody would be paying attention.
Yeah. But the real problem here is, of course, that there are no checks and balances, because, else he couldn't do it.
Yeah, exactly. No, absolutely. And of course, it leads to a very strange discussion. So I always contrast the way the Dutch government sort of has combated the virus with the Hungarian way and the Polish way, is that in the Netherlands, there seems to be genuine debate. I might be mistaken here, and I'm no fan necessarily of the Dutch approach, but it's just that there seems to be a very lively debate, and there's a lot of back and forth between the OMT, like sort of the leading virologists, and the government and the doctors, and people try to come up with a consensus. Here it's just open warfare. So it's the government on one side, the doctors on the other. Doctors are silenced, like they are not allowed to speak to the press. Orban also, that was also a law that Orban came up with during the emergency decree, is that he said spreading fake news or spreading lies that have to do with the pandemic, those are punishable offenses now. You can go to jail for those. And journalists took issue with that, obviously. That was the first group. But secondly, and more crucially, doctors also took offense, because doctors said, what this means is that if I question the government approach to the virus, to the way they're handling the virus, and I tell that to a reporter, maybe I will be jailed. The reporter tells it and quotes me, etc. So I read a case in which a doctor phoned a journalist and said, "This and this is the situation, but please don't quote me because if you do, I'll lose my job and you'll go to jail."
Mm.
So it's very grim. It leads to a lot of fear, because everything that we're talking about, have been talking about so far, it sounds very legal, it sounds very intricate, but what it actually means is that it instills a certain mentality on people. It sort of signals to people it's probably best to keep your mouth shut because you might end up saying something that you regret later.
Yeah.
It's a grim picture, absolutely.
Yeah. But despite that, a lot of people also go into the streets to protest, which we've also seen, of course, in Belarus.
Yeah.
So maybe, well, first of all, does it even work to protest once these state leaders have grabbed this much power?
Yeah, exactly. Well, look, the pictures from Belarus are heroic. I mean, this is something that reminds people in Hungary of '89, and this is kind of the romanticism of revolutions, and it's so obvious to viewers, I think, that Belarusians have history on their side. Now, in Hungary, it's way more difficult because the stakes are set in such a way that it's become the way the system is now set up. You need to beat they need to beat Orban through an election. There's no other way. So
Yeah.
the opposition here is very weak. We haven't really spoken about that, but that definitely doesn't strengthen the hand of people who might want to change things. The opposition is divided. That's the biggest reason for their weakness is that they rarely speak with one voice. Opposition parties range from the MSP, which is the Socialist Party that is sort of the reincarnation of the Communist Party. You can already see that that's problematic to a lot of Hungarians, especially youngsters who feel no nostalgia about the past. Ranging to Jobbik, which people might remember as formerly an ultra right extremist party that held anti-Semitic and xenophobic views. Jobbik has restyled itself now. They claim that they're centrist and that they sort of have moderated their people, but they still have a lot of those sort of anti-Semites in their ranks. So imagine having to collaborate, having all those people speaking with one voice. It's impossible, and they haven't done well. When it comes to demonstrators, I mean, there are cases in which people, of course, do raise their voice. Budapest being a prime example, as I said, like the mayor here, who I also interviewed twice, he was voted in by an urban electorate that is very much done with Fidesz rule. There's a very interesting case happening now at a university, which is the University for Theatre and the Academy for Theatre and Fine Arts, and I should say Theatre and Film. It's about 5 minutes from where I live, and I also wrote a story about that. I'm happy to share that as well in the Facebook. That university, that academy, is under threat because once again a new law was introduced that would strip it of its autonomy, its independence. So in the past, the university had autonomy, as most universities could rule itself. The rector and the student body and sort of all these autonomous bodies would decide on the budget, on the curriculum, etc. And now the government said, you know what, we're going to restructure all of the universities in Hungary. We need to make them more efficient. So the language, once again, is very sort of legalese and sounds very innocent. But what it did in practice is that universities would fall directly under the ministry. They used to fall under the Ministry of Education, but now there would be a new board for this particular academy, a new board of trustees. And who are the members of that board of trustees? Well, political appointees from Orban's ranks, who don't even have a history in most of them in theater or in film. So the students very interestingly rebelled, and they occupied. From September 1st, they started occupying their main building, and they've been doing so ever since. So it's almost 50 days now that they are just occupying their building and saying that they won't leave. They won't leave the building until their demands are met, and their first demand is to restore the old situation. So that's interesting. So it's not. It's of course you can put up a fight, and there are still opposition media. We haven't really talked about the media yet, but there are ways of getting your message out. It's just that you have to be very resourceful, and you have to have a lot of patience, because it takes a lot of time to make a change.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that was very interesting, and I hope that gave a good introduction to the modern autocracies of the world. Now we will turn to questions from the audience. So if you have a question, please place it in the chats of Facebook or YouTube. And I see some people also already have some questions for you. Thomas Rep asks, I'm sure you know him, Jenne, has the social democratic post World War II consensus perhaps not translated well to the economic realities of Eastern European / ex-communistic countries?
All right. Well, that's a great question. I need to preface my answer by saying that I do know Thomas because he's a great friend of mine, and I was also a member. We haven't really talked about this. I was also a member in the past of SIP, so this feels very much at home to me to be speaking to you and to all the others. So so thanks for your question, Thomas. Well, look. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the post World War II. Let me see if I understand the post World War II order. Whether it has translated into a prosperous economy for Eastern Europe.
Yeah, if it has not translated well to the economic realities of these Eastern European countries.
Exactly, it's very the thing. It's a super important question, and once again, there are books written about this. But I'll try to summarize it. The problem is that after '89, there was this naive and in hindsight, naive and almost irrealistic hope and expectation that the soon-to-be member states of the European Union, so back then the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Poland, they all became members in 2004. I remember talking to a guy from the PvdA who was in the European Parliament at the time, and the Dutch Labour Party, and who told me that he thought that everything would be fine. At the time, these countries had been let in, had been on a promise that they would reform and that they would implement all of the sort of the checks and balances that we've been talking about tonight: independent judiciary, civic space, freedom of the press, freedom of information, freedom to speak your mind, of demonstrations and all those things. And that all happened, and that was a miracle on itself that it all happened so fast. But now we're sort of waking up to a more grim reality, which is that in hindsight, this was also a process. This process of implementing reforms was also a process that was very perceived by a lot of Poles and Hungarians and Czechs as very sort of top down and also almost paternalistic. So this is also kind of a revolt against what somebody has very interestingly phrased as imitation. So I'm referring now to a Bulgarian political scientist called Ivan Krastev. If anybody tonight is interested in reading more about Eastern Europe, I do recommend reading Ivan Krastev. His stuff has been translated. His latest books have also been translated into Dutch. Krastev basically says that the revolt that we're witnessing in Poland and in Hungary is a revolt against imitation, right? So the idea being that if you were the West and I was the East, all I had to do to become respected is to imitate you. I just needed to be more like you. I needed to do whatever you had in your system, a constitution like you had, right? So all of the institutions that you had, it all sounds perfectly fine. But if you think about the way imitation works psychologically, it's always very different, because you realize one day, I will never be exactly like you. I can aspire to become a bit like you, but I'll always be different. And that idea that I'm actually different, and that Hungarians will also say, we're different, we're proud. And this is this notion of pride, and also a wounded pride, because mind you, that notion of being different was not really translated into the political reality back in the 90s and 2000s, at the time of accession, right? Because the whole euphoria was around becoming more like the same. Everybody had to be a bit like Germany, and then everything would be fine. And now we're waking up in a world where certain countries are saying we don't want to be like Germany. We want to be like ourselves. And just to share a little anecdote, I went to a museum recently where one of the Hungarian people working there, a lady, very kind, she was showing me around. The exhibition was all in Hungarian, so I couldn't really make sense of it. So she translated some of it. And then she showed me a map. She said, yeah, one of my colleagues told me that you really need to see this map. And the map was about a treaty from 1920, so exactly 100 years ago. Hungary is sort of celebrating or commemorating 100 years since that treaty. It's called the Treaty of Trianon. And those are the kind of symbols that treaty, very briefly, the treaty stripped Hungary of 2/3 of its territory. It's huge trauma. Hungary used to be a kingdom going all the way from what's now Slovakia to parts of Romania now. They lost that territory after World War I, and it's a trauma. It's a lingering trauma. And those types of traumas are sort of now coming to the fore, are now translated by Orban and others into a discourse that says, look, we're different. The West might have helped us for a while back in the 90s, but now it's time to stand on our own feet. And it's a very attractive idea, and I completely see its appeal for a lot of voters. So I don't know if that answers your question, Thomas, but I think this is crucial. So indeed, this post World War II consensus, where if you do whatever the checklists say is needed for liberal democracy, then everything will be fine. Well, it turns out that it's slightly more complicated than that, and it has very much to do, as your question also suggested, with the economics of it, which we can also go into more deeply maybe later.
Okay. Then we have another question from Maya. She asks, what is the role of the media? That's something that you want to address. And propaganda in the rise of authoritarianism, especially current politics in Hungary and the US.
Yeah, exactly. Well, great question. Look, if you don't mind, I'll sort of leave out the American example and Fox News and the like. I'm as much of an expert on that as most of you, I think. So I'll leave that out. But in case of Hungary and Poland, it's super important and very telling. Is that in both cases, after the governments here came in power, one of the first things that they did is they reinstalled a new leadership. They installed new leaders at the public media broadcasters. So the NOS, basically, but the Dutch NOS, but then translated to Hungary and Poland. So now, if I would tune into M1, for example, that's the Hungarian state news channel, I can call it propaganda, but even people who work there are happy. I spoke to one of them recently who quit, and he was embarrassed himself for working there for a few years. It's propaganda by all accounts. It's very brazen, pushing narratives that are so overly pro government that they're almost a laughing stock. And the same in Poland, unfortunately. So this was also a backlash to once again this old paradigm, meaning when I moved to Poland in 2016, I started hearing people saying, well, look, it might not be perfect now, but you weren't here when the previous government was here. And the idea was that before Law and Justice, so before 2015, liberal talk was sort of the norm of the day. Poland just had to be more like Germany, et cetera, and there was no room for conservative voices. That was the idea. So the ruling parties will say, well, we're not installing propaganda. We're just correcting, if you will, the discourse that was way to the left anyway. And now in Poland, they'll say, if you're not happy with the state media, then you can look at a commercial channel, which is not owned by us, and they are more critical, which is true. So you have these two colliding worlds. You can look at state media and get one picture, or you can look at commercial TV, which is more government critical, and that's true for Poland and Hungary. In Hungary, it's more dire. There's not a lot of pluralism left on TV. It's actually almost all of it is government leaning. For reasons that I'll get into in a bit. On radio, it's the same. The only place where there's actual plurality, I would say, of broadcasting of media is online. So there are still 4, 5, 6 proper sort of independent news outlets online. The rest has fallen into the hands of oligarchs who sort of have sold out to Orban. So the Hungarian setup is that there are a few people, media moguls, like entrepreneurs who have made a huge profit after the fall of communism, and they're happy to sort of toe the government line in return for certain investments that they'll receive, etc. And it leads to very tragic cases because, for example, over the summer, a flagship news website called Index lost its independence and was basically shut down. I mean, it still exists, but it's now a government mouthpiece. And what happened at Index is also this. I mean, a new owner bought shares, saying he had no other ulterior motives. But then after a while, actually, he started, he fired the editor-in-chief and he said, I want to shuffle things through. And then all of the staff left because they knew that it was time that it would be another takeover. Much like things like that had happened before in Hungary over the past 10 years. It's a pattern. An oligarch steps in, says he's only there for the commercial side of things, but actually then puts his foot down and just changes the whole direction of the channel or of the website. So yeah.
Okay. I hope that answered her question.
Mm-hmm.
Then we have another question from ISO. He says, thanks for your talk. And he wonders, what is the role of the EU in the cases of Hungary and Poland?
Yeah.
Aside from being a scapegoat, can the EU in any way protect democracy?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm very happy with that question because it's been on my mind since we started talking as well, is that this is probably the key difference between Poland and Hungary on the one hand, and the other countries that we've been mentioning all along. So Russia, Belarus, America. So these countries have as some legal experts would say, have gotten away with murder, right? So they're in a family that prides itself on the rule of law. So we're a European family. We've got 27 member states, and 2 members have decided that, for one cornerstone of the European Treaty, which is Article 2, it pertains to the rule of law, that article doesn't really pertain to them, that they're happy to relinquish that and sort of replace it with their own ideals. And it's super problematic. And the European Union has been, well, you can say a few things about it. Have they done things? Yes. So there's a procedure called Article 7, which I won't go into. It's also very complicated. It's very bureaucratic, but Article 7 is the only sanction mechanism basically that the European Commission has. It started Article 7 against Poland in 2016. And last year, the European Parliament, which also has the right of initiative, launched Article 7 against Hungary. I think last year or the year before, probably the year before. So we have 2 Article 7 procedures, and none of them is going anywhere, to be frank. There are multiple reasons for that, but it mostly has to do with the member states. Because if we talk about the European Union, it's always a question of who are we talking about? Are we talking about the Commission, the day-to-day administration? Are we talking about the Parliament? Or are we talking about the member states? And in this case, it's the member states that have to sort of push through. We've now, for example, we have a German presidency. Germany is holding the rotating presidency, and they have to put on the agenda of the ministers who gather every week or so, every few weeks. They have to put on the agenda what the Council of Ministers will discuss. So the German presidency, if they wanted to, can put on the agenda Article 7. They can say, we want to talk about this, and thereby push it forward. Because at the end of Article 7, Poland and Hungary can be stripped of their voting rights in the council, which would be tremendous. That'll be a huge moment in a way, because it has never happened before in the history of the European Union. And the fact that it has never happened before also makes other member states very hesitant to use it. It's seen as a very blunt instrument that will only antagonize those two countries more. So therefore, it's not really used. There's another avenue which has been a bit more successful, which is the route to the ECJ, the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg. In the case of Poland, for example, judges in Poland who were sidelined and silenced filed complaints with the court in Luxembourg and said this is against EU law, and they won all those cases. Up until now, the case law in Luxembourg is very clear: is that everything that's happening in Poland is against EU law, because once again it violates the impartiality and independence of the judiciary. It's clear cut. The problem is that it's very slow. For example, only last week did the court in Luxembourg rule in the favor of a university called the CEU, the Central European University, which was kicked out by Viktor Orban in Hungary. The kicking out of that university was also very complicated. Part of the university is still operating here, but the biggest chunk went to Jenne, to Austria, but that university also filed with Luxembourg, and they won. But it's 3 years after the law was implemented and after they lost their seat in Hungary. So the procedures in Hungary are very slow, and the same goes for the rest of the sort of the whole European framework, if you will. Is that the European law and the statutes and the treaties are the only things that the European community has, because on the other if you compare it with, for example, Brexit or all these other pressing issues, those tend to be on the top of the agenda, whereas if you talk about a judge in Poland or a certain law that was introduced in Hungary, it tends to be very parochial, sort of very, very overlooked and misunderstood also often. It doesn't carry the weight that sometimes people here might think it carries. So overall, look, once again, it depends a bit on where you look at the European at the institutions, which institution you expect the action from. Member states have definitely let down Poles and Hungarians. The Commission has tried its best to, people might remember Frans Timmermans, the Dutch commissioner, who had a huge fight with the Polish government for a few years. I think he did what he could, but it's not an easy job to try and sort of get a member state to change its behavior like that. So it's a very mixed bag. Maybe just on a final note, I don't want to forget this, is that we posted an article on the website, the Facebook page, about the links with Germany, and we won't go into that now, but it's very interesting how Germany specifically, because of its economic interests in Hungary, has been very lenient towards Hungary specifically. So if people want to read more about that, I really, really recommend that article.
So basically, there's a lot of red tape and
yeah.
Okay. We have a question from Klaske. She says, thanks, JJ. Lately, I have been wondering which reaction to blatantly authoritarian behavior is more effective. So strategically ignoring the loud Trump-esque voices so as to not provide them a platform, or should you, as a journalist, keep describing and denouncing this growing authoritarian discourse, even if it might attract more attention to it. So that's very interesting, and also questions your job.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's a very interesting dilemma, if you will. I think that the biggest sort of, as Kloske mentioned, it's a good question. I mean, what you mentioned is Trump, right? So I think that the biggest dilemma there is for American reporters, because they have to wonder every day whether to report on his tweets, his sort of erratic things that he says. I wouldn't. I have a colleague in New York, and I don't envy him. I mean, it's a very difficult position to be in. My job is more straightforward, to be honest. Like, to name one example, the most recent story I did in Hungary was about the university students and about how they occupied their building, and and I interviewed them and had them explain what it is that happened exactly to their institution. And there, it's very clear cut as a reporter for me why it is that I have to tell that story, which is that something is at stake. There's an institution, a prestigious academy that has this massive history in Hungary. It was founded, I think, before 1900, and people who are familiar with the film Casablanca, it was made by a guy in Hollywood who has Hungarian roots. He was educated at that academy. So, these are flagship institutions that have worked for years and decades under autonomy, independence, etc. And from one day to the other day, they're told, you know what, there's a new leadership now, and they want you to do more Christian or more conservative or more right-leaning curriculum, or more plays that have to do with Christian identity or Christian nationality. And it's not about political preferences. It's about the question: can an institution still be independent? CEU, I also mentioned the university that was kicked out. It was a very, I mean, they managed to keep some part of their operations here, but as I said, they mostly moved to Vienna. And it's a very strange thing. They were attacked because they were founded by George Soros, who we also haven't mentioned, but it's kind of like the bogeyman of Hungarian politics. Soros is now lives in the U.S. He's 90, I think 90 years old. He's this wealthy philanthropist who was born in Hungary and supported NGOs and civic groups and institutions and that university as well, and founded it in the 90s. And he was attacked, and then they came for his university. They said it doesn't align with the ideas that we have sort of been mandated to push. It doesn't align with our ideas of where Hungary is going, and they devised an education law, and that law was, once again, it's very legalistic, but it basically forced them to leave the country. So just to go back to your question, Kloske, in this case, for me it's very clear cut that reporting on what's happening in these countries, I don't think that carries any side effects to the negative. If you see what I mean, I don't think that writing about what's happening here is in that sense a bad idea. You can wonder whether it has any effects. I mean, there does remain a big chasm between, I think, my readers in Holland and what's happening here. It feels a bit distant sometimes. There's the language barrier. There's all these, we don't have a lot of history in common. Hungary has a very different history than the Netherlands. So it's difficult in that sense to have people in the Netherlands really understand how it is that things work here.
Yeah.
But I do try.
Yeah. This also reminds me of the slogan of the Washington Post: "Democracy dies in darkness."
Yeah.
I think that's fitting.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, once again, this is very fitting for where the U.S. is heading, with its elections now. And there's good signs and bad. One great sign is that after the Trump election in 2016, the readership of the New York Times and the Washington Post really skyrocketed. A lot of people were like, okay, wow, with this guy in office, I really need to read a paper. Yeah. And that's, of course, the reaction that you're hoping for as a reporter. Yeah. So no, absolutely. It's a good slogan.
Okay. Then we also have another question from Yelyer. He asks, how much depends the authoritarianism in Poland and Hungary on their leaders? So in other words, will the authoritarianism be gone when Orban and Kaczynski are gone, if that's even possible? But anyway.
Well, it's a very good question. Yeah. Well, it's very interesting. I'll start with Poland because Kaczynski is quite old. And I remember when I was in Warsaw, there would be, rumors. Sometimes he had a knee injury and he would be in hospital, and you would have this swerve of rumors where people are saying, he might be frail, maybe he has to leave office, and and sort of cease to be the guy in control. He's still there, but he's quite old, and what we haven't talked about is that Law and Justice, his party, is kind of an umbrella organization for three right-wing, sort of right conservative political parties. And of the three, the biggest is Law and Justice, but there are two others as well. The idea is that Kaczynski is the glue that holds these three together. He's the only one in the party who's kind of capable of having them to come around and doing and basically running a coalition. And a few weeks ago, that coalition was also trembling a bit. There was a moment when there was an idea that maybe there would be new elections and that the coalition would fall. So if there is a big if in Poland, if Kaczynski either dies or has to step away, the political right will have a huge problem on its hands anyway, because they tend to not get along themselves without him around. So very typical, for example, the Prime Minister Morawiecki doesn't get along with the Minister of Justice, Ziobro, who's known. Ziobro, the Minister of Justice, is the guy who engineered basically this whole purging of the judiciary that we talked about, the judges, etc. And it's known that he wants to become the new guy in town once Kaczynski steps away. But Morawiecki, the Prime Minister, also has that ambition. So it's either or. It's one of them who will become the new power figure. But we don't know who, and crucially, we don't know whether they can see eye to eye when something like that happens. So there, it's very interesting. And when it comes to Hungary, well, Orban is the most gifted politician. You have to grant him that in terms of strategy and thinking ahead. The most gifted politician of his generation, I think, especially certainly in Hungary, but you can also think about the European perspective. He's one of the longest sitting prime ministers right now in Europe. I think after Merkel, and Rutte is also a close one. I think Rutte and he also started in the same year. Orban has outgrown Hungary a bit. Hungary is only a country of 9 million people, and if you look at the way Orban postured during the migration crisis, for example, when he built a fence and started saying that Europe was importing terrorists and all that, he became like an idol for the far right in all of Europe. And people were thinking at the time also that he might be in for a bigger job in Brussels or somewhere else. Up until now, he's still in Budapest, and he started living in a castle as well. So it's interesting how sometimes power goes to people's heads. Like he moved very symbolically. He moved across the Danube River to like a castle that oversees the city. So now he's really sort of living this sort of monarch style life.
Yeah, he's in his ivory tower.
In a way, yeah. So what a post-Orban Hungary looks like, we really don't know. But what a lot of Hungarians are worried about now is simply how to vote him out, and if that's ever sort of possible in the next years. Yeah.
Okay. Well, we touched upon a lot of stuff. I still think it's like the tip of the iceberg, and there's a lot of it under it. But I'm very glad that we had this discussion. So that was all the time we had. Thank you very much to the audience for watching and sending in your questions. And of course, Jan, thank you very much for your time and effort. And again, And again, you can leave your vote by clicking on the link in the description below. please do that, because then we know how we did. And if you are interested in our student association SIP, consider becoming a member, as you can do so all year. If you're already a member, great. Let's have online drinks on our Discord server. And next week we have another online talk about the future of the forests, which is, well, some forests are, well, a lot of forests are endangered. So we'll talk about that. And this is in collaboration with the Dutch Association for the UN, or the Nederlandse Vereniging voor de Verenigde Naties. So that was all. So please, everyone, stay safe, stay healthy, and hopefully until next time. So goodbye.